For a night and a half, I was a superstar. Some of you may have heard this story, and I swear that every word of it is true. Remember middle school? Or maybe you were old enough that it wasn't middle school whenever you were in that age, that maybe it was junior high for you. Remember how it was, kind of the awkward stage there of the preteen to teen transition and all that kind of goes along with that? Now, I'm sure that some of you absolutely killed middle school, that you were just like the boss. You were like the ones that were in charge, the popular people. You just nailed it, and maybe that was some of the best years of your life. Not for me, though. Middle school was rough for me. It was probably best personified by the fact that one time, actually it was my 8th grade year, that I found out my vision was bad, and I got glasses. And so between my 7th and 8th grade year, I had to get glasses. And the first day I wore those glasses, I wore them to church. And I remember one of the little old ladies who was just as sweet as could be came to me and she says, "Oh, I love your glasses. They make you look like a little professor." Now, I am a professor now, so it's not a bad compliment to say, but back then it was not something I was interested in looking like, and that was kind of the definition of me. I look like a nerd, a professor, or whatever the case may be, but for a night and a half, I was a middle school superstar. It was middle school dance season, and I was following the normal middle school dance protocol, where no one really dances. They just kind of stand on the outside edges, and it's always guys on one side and girls on the other, and you just kind of hang back, and maybe once in a while there's a slow dance that comes on. You come out and you find somebody to dance with. But then the DJ played a song. Have you ever heard a song that seemed to give you an irresistible urge to move? It comes on the radio, and you just feel like you need to bob your head a little bit, maybe get the duck face going, kind of bob your shoulders a little bit. Well, the song came on and the urge came over me, and the urge was so strong that it actually overpowered my normal tendency to sit in the corner and be quiet. So the song came on and it started kind of slow. I just kind of back and forth, just kept it right here, just kind of, whatever. And then all of a sudden, it kind of started to grow. My arms got a little higher. My hand got up in the air. And then all of a sudden, I was going nuts. And the fact, by the way, that quiet, reserved Chris Beard was actually moving must have been quite the shock, because soon a crowd grew around me. And within moments, the crowd around me consisted of every other middle school student in the room. The room had literally stopped what they were doing, had exited the sides of the dance arena area, and they came around me to watch me bust a move. And I was busting them, let me tell you. I was doing some things that you would not believe. I was killing it. As the crowd gathered around and was watching me, they were smiling, and it gave me more confidence. And I just kind of let loose and cut loose. And let me tell you, like I said, I was killing it. Now, some of the moves were probably not appropriate for the church, so I will not show them to you today. But there was probably some kind of things like this, and some gyrations, and maybe some exaggerated pelvic thrust kind of thing, which is not good. And then the worm. I was just nailing it, and I was nailing it so much that the entire crowd started chanting, "Go Chris! Go Chris! Go Chris!" And I'm going nuts. I'm going crazy. And when the song was done, the crowd erupted. And I strutted off the dance floor like the superstar that I was. And it didn't take long for people to come over and to beg me to show off my skills another time. They couldn't get enough. They wanted to see it again. And so I told them what song that I wanted them to request from the DJ, and when it came on, I gave the crowd exactly what they wanted. And I was a superstar that night. A few weeks later, it was time for another dance. And I walked into that Methodist church basement with a bit of a spring in my step. But I had a plan. I was going to play coy. I was going to be the old Chris Beard, and I was going to make people come to me, and if they wanted to see it again, and come to me they did. And it didn't take long until they came begging to me to bust a move or two, and I finally relented, kind of this fake reluctance, like, oh, no, I can't do. Okay, sure, let's go. And so they played the song, and I cut loose, and once again there was a circle, and there was the chant once again, and I returned to my wallflower position on the sideline, and I waited for the demand of my fans later in the night. I had decided that I would only give in twice per night. That was my plan. Only 2 times per night could I give the crowd, because for a couple reasons. I didn't want to give too much, and partially because there were only 2 Tone Loc songs that the DJ would play. Yes, Tone Loc is who I said. If you don't know who that is, do not Google him. And of course, the people demanded a return, so the song came on. I did my thing, and the circle and the chants, everything happened just as it did before, but except for one thing. This time it was different. As I looked out into the crowd, as I dropped down to do the worm, I realized something. That the looks on the faces of the crowd were no longer amazement and joy. This time it was clear that that some, and actually probably many, of the crowd surrounding me, they were not actually cheering me on, but it actually seemed like maybe they were mocking me. I was superstar for a night and a half. That last half wasn't so good. Now, I really believe the crowd had turned fickle. I believe that at first, they really did love it. They were shocked to see quiet, skinny Professor Nerd Chris Beard busted a move in the middle of the middle school dance. And I think they were amazed, and they were really cheering me on. But I think they turned fickle, that the crowd of support had turned into a crowd of mocking in the blink of an eye. Have you ever found yourself in an environment that you thought was once supportive, but somehow it became hostile to you? You thought everything was good. You thought you were being supported. You thought that they were on your side. And then all of a sudden, it seems like things are different. Maybe it's a workplace that's transitioned due to new leadership. Under the old boss, you were getting along just fine. You were succeeding. You were doing well. But the new guy comes in. All of a sudden, it's like everything is tension-filled. Or maybe it's a restaurant that you used to regular, and you walk in and they'd say Norm or whatever your name is, and you go in and they'd have your order for you. They know what you were or what you ordered, and then all of a sudden the management changed and they didn't really care about you anymore. Or maybe it's a relationship that went sour. Well, the truth is, that's the situation the church finds ourselves in today. In a situation where at one point we found support, but all of a sudden it became hostile. As you've heard me say before, the church used to be the home team. The church used to exist in our culture, in this country, in a place that was supportive, in a place that was on board, that would cheer on the church, that we were accepted, we were a normal part of society, but that is actually no longer the case. It is no longer the case that we are the home team. We used to have people cheering us on, but now it's a hostile environment. It's a hostile environment where we're looked at with skepticism, we're looked at with judgment, we're looked at with disdain. And the truth is that the world we exist in, the very world that God has called us to engage with and to love as ourselves, the very world that God has called us to share His love and gospel with, really doesn't want to have much to do with the church anymore. The world that we're supposed to make disciples of all nations, that Jesus said, that world doesn't really want to have much to do with the church. Now, here's the thing. Here's what we have to own. A lot of it's our fault. Maybe you've watched the news, and you saw that recently, this past week, it's been exposed that another denomination, the Southern Baptist denomination, had history of sexual abuse within that denomination, and that leadership, key leaders, had covered it up and had not defended those who needed to be defended. It's just another story of abuse and wrongdoing and sin in what is known as the church. And let me tell you this. It has nothing to do with Christ Covenant Church. We're not a part of that denomination. We're not part of the Catholic faith. But you can bet that the world, when they look at this church, they are going to associate, not just this church, any church, they are going to associate us with our worst examples and with our biggest weaknesses. And by the way, you might say, oh, that's somebody else, it's not our fault, but I will tell you that there's a lot that is our fault. A lot that is our fault personally. that we've kind of not given the right picture of what the church or what Jesus should stand for should be. You know, we've talked about before how oftentimes the church is often known for what it's against more than what it's for. That's not the kind of thing that Jesus would want from us. And so I think we have this idea of scandals. We have hate that has come from different kinds of the church, or different examples of the church, or even people. We have hypocrisy. That's probably the biggest thing that we hear. And we have a lack of love. And that is our fault. And so that's part of the reason why we're no longer the home team as a church. But I will also say that some of that is because the support wasn't real in the first place. The people cheered us on not because they were on board with Jesus, but because that was just kind of the cultural, excuse me, that was just kind of the cultural norm of the time. That's kind of how everybody lived. And it all kind of aligned. And it wasn't necessarily a Christ thing as much as it was a Christianity thing or a Christendom thing. In fact, I don't lament the loss of how things used to be. A lot of people are like, man, I just wish we could go back. You know, when I was a youth minister, when I first started 20-some years ago, one of the things that I knew at the time is that I could have a youth group on a Wednesday and a Sunday night, and I would have no conflicts because coaches would not have practice. There would be no extracurricular activities. Those were reserved for church. And all of a sudden, somewhere along the way, that changed, and I was competing even on Sunday mornings with different sports leagues and hobby clubs and all these sorts of things. And some people look at that and go, oh, man, I wish we could go back to the way it was when our society was more godly. Well, let me tell you a little harsh fact. If you do your research, you'll realize that our society was not more godly. It just had more cultural norms that may have overlapped or aligned with Christianity. Because when everything is associated with Christianity and is acceptable, then nothing is associated with Christianity. What I mean is what the Apostle Paul described in 2 Timothy 3. When he described a religion, he says, that has a form of godliness but denying its power. There was no power in Christendom because it wasn't based on Christ. For the wide majority of the culture, it was not a Christ-based culture. It was a ethics and morally based culture. And so I don't look back and I don't say, man, I wish we could go back, because I think we have the opportunity now to live in a different way, to share a different message, to show something that is actually true and pure and powerful through Christ. But regardless of where we used to be, the reality is the church finds herself in a mission field that is not altogether receptive to hearing anything from the church. We have good news. I believe that. The gospel of Jesus, which is transforming not just for eternity, but for this world and for this life. It's restorative. It is good news. But the world around us doesn't really want to hear it. It reminds me a great deal of Matthew chapter 10. If you have a Bible, you can open up to Matthew 10. And Matthew 10 is the second part of a 1-2 punch from Jesus. In Matthew chapter 9, Jesus says to pray that God sends workers into the harvest field. He looks on the crowd, and they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send workers into the harvest field. And so he starts out with that, and I'm like, yeah, I'll agree with that. Lord, please send somebody out. But then we have the 2-punch, number 10, in chapter 10, where he says, okay, keep praying, but by the way, I'm sending you. And in this chapter, in Matthew chapter 10, we have Jesus sending the disciples on a specific mission, but he also shares expectations of their mission that actually don't come to fruition until after his death and resurrection. He talks about what the mission field is going to be like. And what we see in this passage is that Jesus is sending the disciples into a context of hostility. Here are some of the things he promises them. He says in verse 17 that they're going to encounter floggings. In verse 21, he talks about that families are going to betray families to the point of death. In verse 22, he says that they're going to be hated. In verse 23, he says they're going to be persecuted. Hostility. If there's a key word to the description of the mission field that Jesus gives, it is hostility. And in this passage, therefore, we can find a context that's not unlike our own. Now, maybe we haven't got to the point where Jesus' followers were as far as persecution and those sorts of things, but we can certainly see that there's a comparison between the hostility of the context there and the hostility of the context for us as well. And the good news is that Jesus didn't just tell his followers about their mission context, but he also gave them some tips, some principles in this passage that would help them accomplish this God-given mission in their lives, a mission that is not unlike our own. By the way, you realize that, right? That the mission that Jesus gave his disciples is the same mission he gives to us today. So it is those principles and those tips that we're going to look at today. Number one, start where you are. Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6 says, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel." Now, if you just read that verse, it doesn't seem very nice, right? It's like, just go to the Jews, don't talk to the Gentiles. And it kind of seems like Jesus is avoiding the Gentiles. He didn't want to send the message. He didn't want to say, and we have this, if you've been in the church very long, you understand that the Jewish people saw the Gentiles as lesser. It was like racism personified to the epitome of racism. Called them dogs, less than, half-breeds, so to speak, particularly for the Samaritans. But the Gentiles in general, they would avoid it. They couldn't even touch them, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything with them. And so maybe you kind of look at that and you say, okay, well, that makes sense. But this instruction could be for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it could be because of God's desire to reach the Israelites. The Jewish people were the chosen nation. And so when Jesus came to bring the kingdom of God into its fullness, initially first through his death and resurrection, and of course when he will return, it was God's desire that his people, his chosen people, would first hear the message of Jesus. I think that could be. But I think it could also have been something even simpler. Perhaps it could have been simply that Jesus wanted his followers to start right where they were. To start right where they were. This certainly, by the way, wasn't a forever command, right? Don't go to the Gentiles. Because later on in Matthew, Jesus says to them, go to all nations, ethnos, go to every people group and make disciples. And so it wasn't a forever command. It wouldn't be long before he commanded that they were to go to all nations. But maybe it just comes down to the fact that you just got to start somewhere. You got to start somewhere. And the disciples would have been going to the areas that they were most familiar with. To reach the people, to do this mission, Jesus said, they would have been going to the areas that they lived, the places that they used to work, the people they knew, and the cultures that they were familiar with, that they fit into. Sometimes this concept of mission seems exotic. One of the questions we're asking in our purpose group of each of us as individuals and an entire church is this question is, to whom are we sent? To whom are we sent? Who are the people that you are sent to? Like Paul says, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. That was his people group. Who are we sent to as individuals? And who are we sent to as a church? We're going to be spending a lot of time working on that and praying about that and trying to figure that out so that we can focus on that. It's an important question to ask, but we must not overlook the fact that in addition to where we are led long term, that we too, like the disciples, may just be, in fact, I would suggest we are called to start right where we are, in our current relationships, in our current neighborhoods, in our current workplaces. Number two, use your words and your actions. You ever told a toddler to use your words? You have that transition for a toddler when they can't talk and now they can talk, and they get frustrated because they want something and you're trying to help them to communicate better, and so you say, use your words, tell me what you want. I think maybe sometimes God looks at us like a bunch of toddlers and says, use your words. We need to be reminded of that as well. This is what Jesus said in verse 7. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. And so we must use our words to proclaim the message. You've heard me say this before, that we are required to use words when we tell the message of Jesus to others. But notice what Jesus partners with the proclamation. He partners with that action. Now, I don't know about you, but you may read that verse and you're like, okay, see, this just points to the disciples. Because I can't heal the sick. I have not been able to raise the dead. I haven't even met somebody with leprosy. And I don't think driving out demons is really my wheelhouse, right? Now, okay, that may be so. Although I would say don't underestimate the power of the Holy Spirit once we start using and partnering with Him about what He can do through us. But I tend to think that there are actually more effective approaches in our culture. You may have heard me talk about this too. I think that if that was an effective thing, If that list of things was an effective approach for our culture, that we would still be doing it on a regular basis, that God would still be doing that. But one of my favorite movies is Bruce Almighty. I know it's not altogether appropriate, and it's not altogether reverent, but I saw it at a time in my life when I was ready to give up on ministry. And I left that movie in tears because I heard God speak through that movie, believe it or not. And he said, guess what? I'm God, you're not, I'm in charge, follow me, and it's going to be okay. And that's when I decided at that point I was going to stay in ministry and continue to do what God had called me to do. Well, in that movie, Bruce is played by Jim Carrey, and he complains to God, and God gives him his powers and puts him in charge so he can see what it's like to be God. And Bruce starts exploring those powers by, first of all, the first thing he does is parting the red soup, the tomato soup, in a diner. That was the first thing he did. And then he uses these powers for all sorts of questionable reasons that are not great. When things inevitably spin out of control, God shows up again. And this is what he says to Bruce in this moment after everything had gone awry. He said, parting a soup is not a miracle, Bruce, it's a magic trick. Now, a single mom who works 2 full-time jobs and still finds the time to pick up her kid at soccer practice, that's a miracle. A teenager that says no to drugs and yes to an education, that's a miracle. You want to see a miracle, son? Be the miracle. Now, I believe that God, that the real God calls us to do a bit more than what the God character says in that quote. But I think it rings very true. That the types of things that really get people's attention in this world today are actions of restoration that are undeserved and unexpected. Exhibitions of love without any sort of expectation of something in return. Fixing the broken, even though it may not have to do with our lives personally. Making life better for someone else. Those are the things that are getting attention. I can promise you one thing. If I all of a sudden healed someone or raised the dead, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, I believe that could be possible. But I promise you, if I brought somebody up on stage today and healed them of whatever illness or whatever the thing they had, the struggle they had, in a very dramatic way, you guys might believe in the power of God and see that. But when it goes out on YouTube, it might get a lot of hits, but I can guarantee you it's going to be met with skepticism. It's just another preacher trying to make some money and to show us the power of God. But it's when real lives are changed that gets people's attention. When you couple words with action, you have a powerful combination. Number 3, keep it simple. Verse 9, do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Now, when I say keep it simple, I don't mean our approach, our message has to be simple, even though that's probably a good idea. I think sometimes we overcomplicate this idea of sharing the good news of Jesus with other people. But what Jesus is saying here is that the disciples couldn't be burdened by any extra hindrances. Another movie, Saving Private Ryan. At the beginning of the movie, they assemble this small team to go find Private Ryan, and there's Corporal Upham, who is a clerk in the Army, and he's drafted into Sergeant Miller's small group of men who would go find Private Ryan. And when he's told it's time to go with his new company, he starts grabbing his stuff. If you've ever seen the movie, at that moment, he starts grabbing all his gear, and he's got like several bags of stuff and all these different things, armor and then a helmet and then a gun, and then he tries to pick up his typewriter. And then that's when Sergeant Miller walks over to him and starts taking off some of his luggage. Starts taking off some of the stuff he can't take with him. And he says, "Well, sir, I'm a writer. What about my typewriter?" And that's when he holds up this. He says, "You can take this." It's a lot easier to carry. It's a pencil, by the way. That's what he has in his hand there. The point was that those items on his mission would be a hindrance to the mission. You can't carry all that stuff if you're going to be going across, fields and doing all these things. You need to be moving quick and agile. And I believe that one of the biggest hindrances in the lives of American Christians is a lack of simplicity and margin in our lives. That we are too tied to things, that we are unable to follow the Holy Spirit wherever He leads because we're burdened by the baggage that we carry. And the baggage, by the way, is not always necessarily evil in and of itself. It's kind of like, I'll give you an example. My life changed when I had kids. Those of you who've had kids, can I get an amen, right? And so what happened is that it was different, and it was not bad, but it changed what I could do. I couldn't just up and go do stuff anymore. I couldn't just, Carrie and I couldn't just on a whim go somewhere if we had a baby to take care of. And so it changes it. And so you're kind of, I hate to say it like this, kids, but my kids were a burden. They were baggage. They still are. Can I get an amen, right? I mean, even though you love them to death, right? They do. They hinder some aspects of our life. And so what happens, I think, is that we do that as Christians, is we put all these different things that we hold on to, we try to put it on ourselves, and when the Holy Spirit says move, we can't because we're too connected or too held back by something. Now, I'm not saying that we should do things like quit our jobs or whatever the case may be or get rid of our kids, but I am saying that we need to live lives that are simple enough that if Jesus says, let's go, that we're able to follow him. But Jesus wasn't always only calling for simplicity in this. He was also calling for number 4. He said, trust in God. There are 2 areas in which Jesus told his disciples to trust. First of all was physically, trust me. He said, we see that in the verse we just read, that the disciple wasn't supposed to take extra supplies because God would take care of their physical needs. And I see this as an extension of simplicity. I got to tell you, this is a tough one that I don't know how easy it would be for me to live by it, but think about this for a moment. What if we depended less on ourselves and more on God for our physical well-being? Think about that. I mean, I would guess that probably 99.9% of us right now depend on ourselves for our financial and material well-being, through our jobs and things like that. Maybe what would happen, though, if we just depended on God more? Maybe it would free us up more, but maybe it would give us a greater testimony. I remember my freshman year of college, I have a friend named Dow Tippett. Shout out to Dow. He's a minister in Ohio, and he lived in Joplin, and he became a friend of mine, and we did a lot of interacting. At the time, he was doing something called the Barnabas Project, and what that was is he would go around to different churches and just do whatever they needed to do for free. So like he'd be a worship minister for 6 months at a church for free, or he'd go do something else. And to do that, he got outside support. And the outside support was not very good. He wasn't making a lot of money. And I'll never forget, one time he came to me and he said, yeah, my truck needs this part. Can't do it. And he couldn't do anything, by the way. The truck was his livelihood. That's how he got around to different ministries. That's how he survived life and did what he had to do. He said, it's okay though, God will take care of it. And he told me about what that repair was going to cost. And I remember 2 or 3 days later, he came to me. Yeah, he said, you're not going to believe this, but this is what I got in the mail. And he held up a check, and it was for the exact amount that he needed to fix his truck. And that's a testimony. That was God providing for him. I really believe that was the case. That God was providing for him in that moment, and that's a testimony. So God provides physically, but also spiritually as well. Verse 19. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you'll be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Now, again, don't misread this verse. This verse does not mean that we shouldn't prepare for the work we have in store in the mission field that God has put in front of us, and we will talk more about that in a minute. Doesn't mean we should just wing it. That, it's all good. It's all good. God will take care of me. The Holy Spirit will speak through me. But what it does mean is that we're not alone. You remember the calling of Moses? Exodus chapter 3, there was the burning bush. He's like, I wonder what's going on. He went over there, and God said, take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. And God calls Moses into this task to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. We read this in verse 11 of chapter 3 of Exodus. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And look at the response. And God said, I will be with you. Who am I? How in the world are you expect me to do this? And God didn't point out Moses' giftedness or his strengths or his skills or his education. He didn't tell him any reason why he was qualified. He just said, guess what? I'll be with you. It's easy to feel insecure in our mission. It's easy to feel inadequate even. But the same that was true for Moses was true for the disciples that Jesus sent, and is true for us today, that God will be with us. And yes, we need to prepare, and yes, we need to learn and study and grow. But in that moment, guess what? This mission is important to God too. He's going to work through us if we allow him to do so. Number 5, be efficient. This one's tough. This is a tough one for me because honestly, I don't have it figured out. The concept reminds me of some of those old game shows I used to watch with my grandma growing up. You know, the ones with the lightning round, or you had a time thing, you had to guess a word, like password, or maybe you were doing like win, lose, or draw, and you had to guess what was on there. And what would happen is, you remember what would happen if somebody got stuck on something? What would they do? What would they say? Pass, right? They'd say pass because they knew that if they spent too much time on that one, they couldn't get the other ones, because usually it was like you got to get as many as you can at a certain amount of time. So they'd pass, and maybe they'd come back to it later, but they'd pass because they didn't want to waste their time on it. Well, Jesus gives two instructions here about efficiency. Verse 23, he says this. He said, when you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. So when you are persecuted, get away from there. And by the way, it's not because he wanted you to protect yourself or to save yourself. In fact, as an aside, it's interesting to note that biblically there are only two responses to persecution in the Bible. Two responses. Number one is go out and be bold anyway. You look at the book of Acts and the apostles, they're flogged. They're told not to preach the gospel anymore, not to preach Jesus anymore. And the Holy Spirit releases them from prison. And you know what he says to do? Go back out in that courtyard where you got arrested and preach again. That's one. The other one is flee. Nowhere do we say defend yourself. Nowhere do we say stand up for yourself. It's always flee and do it somewhere else, or go out in spite of the persecution and be bold anyway. But the idea here is to go somewhere else and to do your work. And then in verses 11 and 14, whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. And I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but there are two things I want to point out here. First of all, it says find someone who is worthy. Now, that doesn't mean like that's good enough. That means somebody that's a person of peace, that's willing to take you in, that's willing to accept and maybe open to the message you have to hear. And notice what it says. Stay at their house until you leave. Be there long term. Be patient. Stick with them. But then he also says, if no one listens, then you need to move on. If no one listens, you need to move on. And this is the tough one for me, like I said. Maybe it's tough for me because you've heard the story of my father, who came to Christ after years and years and decades of my family praying for him, and how God just miraculously one day, Dad answered the call and showed up and became a transformed man. And that, if we would have moved on from Dad, then that would have been a very grave mistake, when all we were doing, we were praying and encouraging him. So that's maybe tough for me for that reason. But it's also tough because certainly God doesn't want us to give up on people. And nor does he want us to treat them like sales marks, right? You know, I had a conversation with one of my friends at Johnson University. Lainey and I were there for a college visit this last week. And one of the ladies that works at Johnson, we were having a conversation over coffee, and she said, you know, the hardest thing is that I try to help people, and sometimes they don't want to help themselves. And so what I have to do is I have to just kind of let go. And I have to focus on someone else that's willing to grow and to help them, you know, grow in that as well. And I think that's kind of what Jesus is saying here. By the way, you don't give up on those people. Because remember, we're not in this we don't have ulterior motives. That's what the sales mark thing is, right? I'm not friends with anyone because I want to bring them to Jesus. I'm not a friend with someone, if I find out they're not going to accept Jesus, I'm like, okay, I'll move on to the next one. That's not what our lives are supposed to be. But we spend our time and energy on those who are willing to listen when it comes to our mission. We build those relationships with everyone that we come in contact with that we can. But we have to understand that at times we need to be efficient and help those who are most receptive to God's voice. So be efficient. Number 6, be smart and live honorably. There's a theme verse to this chapter. It has to be this one, Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And the depth in this verse is actually what we know about the animals that Jesus mentioned. First of all, talking about sheep among wolves. This reiterates that hostile environment. Actually, sheep is probably better translated as lambs. And it's the idea that you got the dinner that goes out amongst the predators, right? The sheep goes out amongst the wolves, and it just reiterates how hostile of an environment it is. But notice two things here. First of all, that sheep are not meant to battle. They're not meant to battle. If Jesus wanted them to battle, to be on the offensive against the wolves, he would talk about, I'm sending you out like rams against wolves. Or maybe even use something completely different. The sheep were not to go on the offensive. The sheep were not to be battling the wolves. And the second thing is that, I don't like this one very much, but Jesus sent them anyway. I'm sending you into this dangerous situation. I'm sending you into this hostile environment. But then there's this clear contrast between the snake and the dove. Jesus says very clearly which characteristics of the animals that we should reflect. That shrewdness of the snake means that we use our brains, we are strategic, we pay attention, we evaluate our context and our surroundings, we be aware of everything around us, all for the sake of Jesus, of being better equipped and better prepared to help lead someone to Christ. And so that means for us that we pay attention to the world around us. We pay attention to the people who what their hearts are, where their hearts are, what their needs are, what their desires are. What good news is to them. But for our shrewdness to be effective, we also must be innocent. This comes back to what we talked about earlier, how we're kind of to blame sometimes for the bad reputation of the church. We must be innocent. We must live lives that reflect what we claim to believe. And by the way, that doesn't mean that we have to be perfect or that we are perfect. It's impossible. But it does mean that our lives are characterized by Christ-like features and that we are actually getting better at it as we go. The problem is that we've often reflected the wrong characteristic. Because, snakes were seen as shrewd at that time, but you know what they were also known as? Evil, wicked, scary, maybe a little still. I hate snakes. I hate them. And so that was the other way they were seen. And, doves were seen as innocent and pure, but you know what else they were seen as? They were kind of seen as silly and stupid, not very smart. Church, I would suggest to you that perhaps the church in our world today, in this country especially, is probably seen more as the wrong side of the snake and the dove, as perhaps wicked and evil and silly and stupid, more than they're seen as shrewd and innocent. That's something we have to work on. That's something we have to work on to put out and to show people the truth about what Christ can do. We live in a hostile context because of the evil that we have either endured or allowed or even supported inadvertently. And again, even though this congregation may or may not have been directly involved in scandal or not directly tied to it, we are connected to it, whether we like it or not. And we also live in a hostile context. The silliness aspect, that's a big one because the church isn't seen as relevant anymore. One of the reasons I believe that people don't want to be a part of a church is because they don't see how it even makes any sense for their lives. There's nothing there for me. There's no wisdom, no truth, no whatever. And I think that's because the teachings that we say we adhere to are a bit silly if they don't result in transformed lives. And so if we say Jesus transforms us and gives us full life, but we don't live out that full life, and people see that, then they're going to be a little skeptical about the message if they don't see the results. And so we should be smart and live honorable lives that bolster the words of good news that we have to share. And we must be ready because the last truth that Jesus shares throughout this whole passage is number 7, is no, it won't be easy. Again, listen to some of the things Jesus said would be true for the disciples. It most certainly will be true for us. Verse 14, he says, some won't listen. And by the way, that's the easiest part of it. That's not a good thing, by the way. It means that we're going to go out and we're going to if we tell people about Jesus, that some people aren't going to listen. And that is the least of it. Because then he says in verse 17, they're going to be resisted by religious leaders and they were going to be flogged. In verse 18, they're going to be resisted by secular leaders. Verse 21, that families will be characterized by betrayal and death. And verse 22, people will hate God's messengers. Number 23, persecution is likely. Verse 28, he says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. And do you know what that means? If he's saying, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, that means that death is a possibility. And then in verse 34, do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace but a sword. And then I say, no wonder we have a tendency to withdraw into our holy huddles, to retreat to the church building and to our small groups and to say, okay, this is good. We'll just stay right here and let's huddle up and circle the wagons because I don't know if we can handle what is out there. But there's one more characteristic that we have to always remember. And it's what Jesus led with in the first place in the previous chapter. Chapter 9, verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And that's number 8. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. You see, we live in a hostile context that may not be receptive to the good news and may not only not be cheering us on as Christians, but also might be against us. And it's a brutal environment to be a missionary in, something that we're all called to do. But here's the thing. I look out at this congregation, and I see people that I know would do some amazing things for temporary results. Let me tell you what I mean. I'm absolutely certain that there are men in this room that if they walked out after church today into the parking lot and there were still people milling around in the church building and all of a sudden it caught on fire, there would be men and women that may run back into the fire, putting their own lives at danger to try to rescue someone. I believe that to be the case. I see people here, parents, fathers and mothers, that would give up their own comforts and their own desires and their own livelihood to help their own children, to give sacrificially in that way. I see people in this room that would give sacrificially to family members without expecting anything in return. I see people that would truly help strangers in ways that would help them have a meal or a place to stay. Or I see love. I see that you as a congregation would go out of your way and do difficult things for temporary solutions. I say temporary because you know what? If this building is burning and John Norris comes back in and saves me and I don't die that day, that's amazing. But you know what? I'm still going to die. And even though I may give something up for my kid, that's only a temporary thing. And even though I may help a family member or a stranger, those are all temporary things. And here's my point. How much do we give to provide temporary results for people around us, those we love or otherwise? Church, it's a hostile environment, but can you just imagine and wrap your head around for just a moment the fact that what we are able to share with people is good news that has eternal consequences. That has eternal consequences. That starts right here and right now. That allows them to find that purpose, that full life that God has promised them, but also doesn't end when life ends. Doesn't end when Jesus returns. You see, the promise is it's going to be rough. But here's the other promise that Jesus made. The harvest is plentiful. That means that in the midst of the wolves, in the midst of the crowd that is against God and the church, or even just the church, not necessarily God, and in the midst of a world that's just hostile, there are still people who are desperate and willing to hear the good news of Jesus. And those are the people we're sent to. Let's pray. God, I pray that you'll help us to engage, that you'll help us to enter into this world, and again, to show love to everyone we come in contact with, to live lives that are shrewd and innocent simultaneously. Lord, I pray that you'll help us to show people that regardless of what they decide for you, that they are our friends, they are loved, but that we have something not because of who we are, or not because we're great or awesome, but because of who you are. And like one beggar helping another beggar find bread, that we can help people find the full life and the eternal life that you offer them. So in the midst of hostility, Lord, I pray you'll give us boldness. In the midst of hostility, I pray you'll give us patience. In In the midst of hostility, I pray you'll give us peace. In the midst of hostility, I pray you'll continue to give us guidance. And let us continue to love the way you've called us to. Let us serve the way you called us to, so that some might come to know you, not just for temporary gain, but for eternal gain. We pray this in Jesus' name.